Good morning. So today's video, I had an idea earlier. I was out in the garage and looking at my Shelby, and here it is January, and supposedly this big winter storm's supposed to come through. So we're heading into the seasonal winter depression months, and so I'm looking at my Shelby and like to get it out a little bit and wishing it was warmer and go take it for a nice little cruise. But out of all my videos, I really never went into like my background. I've said I've been an automotive mechanic and in the automotive industry for, I'd say, almost 30 years of experience there, but never really got into too much of my credentials and kind of my experience in life. Now, I know y'all are probably looking at me going, oh, he's a younger looking guy. How can he have all this experience? Well, I've been working on cars since I was about 8 or 9 years old. Started helping my grandpa. Now, a little bit about my family. Most of them have all passed. But of course, some of you that watch these videos know I lost my mom 2 years ago. But all my uncles have passed. But my family was not the stay in a new car type people. Um, I was I was born in 1981, and I was born into a family that had all cars from the 60s and early 70s. Um, I think at the time I remember my uncle driving a 70s something 76, 77 Ford F-150 or F-100 at the time. They hadn't adopted the 150 yet. And My grandpa had the same body style at the time, F100. My uncle's was tan, my grandpa's was green, two-tone green. And my grandmother had a 67 LTD that she had. That was her only car she ever had. My mom had a 67 Mustang. As a matter of fact, the story behind that was mom bought her 67 Mustang, and then my grandmother went like a few weeks later. My grandpa went a couple weeks later and bought my grandmother's LTD, and they bought them in the same color, dark moss green, and they so that they could share touch-up paint. So he bought one bottle of touch-up paint, and he bought it in the same color so they could both share it. So, little fun fact on that. But I grew up in that time frame, so around those older cars. And so that's how I got my experience working on those older 60s, 70s cars. They had points and plugs, and they had the little dimmer pedal next to on the floorboard, right? And nowadays you just flip your switch on your steering wheel if you want brights or not. But back then it was a little button on the floor. You had to tap it with your foot. It almost became a fourth pedal. But So I grew up working on those, and then a couple of my uncles had some vehicles from the 80s. Like one of my uncles had a Ford Ranger from the 80s, little 4-cylinder 5-speed, and then he also had like a Ford Granada. Those were not. They were probably popular as a beginner car. They were probably the equivalent of a Chevy Cruze now, but they weren't fancy by any means, and I don't even think they're considered classic collectibles at this point. They were there and they're gone, and that's that. And then of course, my first car that I bought was a '89 Pontiac Grand Am. And I didn't know much about cars then. I mean, yeah, I helped Papa tinker around with stuff, but I didn't know what was good, bad, or avoid this, avoid that. And of course, it had that treacherous quad 4 engine, and it didn't last long. But I'm not going to go into the history of every car I've ever had or whatever. But I have experience. I've worked on the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way through. And there's another YouTuber that I've watched, and I like his channel, and he's part of what like inspired me to start. It wasn't the sole inspiration, but like one of the creators that inspired me to start my channel, and it's Uncle Tony's Garage. And I remember watching a video where he basically said he just got to a point of there's a certain generation of vehicle that just didn't want to fool with anymore. And kind of that's what happened to me after all my years. And I got to where these newer hybrids and EVs, I really don't have any interest in trying to work on those. So for me, I would say anything beyond 2010. I mean, I know there's a few models past 2010, but it's going to be kind of picky and choosy there. But really, I would say after 2010, I don't really want to mess with it. Just too many electronics and new technology and new ways for things to go wrong. And cars nowadays are built, what I will agree with him on is, they're more appliance based now. Except for what gets me is like new TVs, new appliances are cheaper. But when it comes to the automotive industry, you put technology in a vehicle, it somehow triples the price. Because if you think back, all right, think back with like those flat screen TVs, when everything went from tube TVs to flat screen TVs, and those became a thing. Yeah, those were expensive, right? Because it's a new concept, a new thing. But over time, flat screen TVs have gotten cheaper. They're cheap, right? You can get I think everybody nowadays, most people have over a 50-inch TV. They don't have anything smaller than a 50-inch unless they're using it for a computer monitor. But because they've gotten attainable. But when they first came out, they were $1,000. Who had $1,000 for a TV? You had to be pretty well off to do that. But now they're putting basically the size of a small tablet screen on a vehicle dash, and the vehicle's $50,000. It does not make sense to me. So I said that to say, yeah, for me, I like stuff that's in between that modern and classic realm. 2010s were just an improvement over the 90s. All right, the 2000s, we'll say, were an improvement over the 90s. Because in the 2000s is when the horsepower started getting added back into the vehicle. Because the 80s was restricted because you're coming out of the 70s fuel crisis. And so 1980s is when you've seen a lot more of the compacts, subcompact cars that were popular and sold. Your Chevy Chevettes, your Ford Escorts. Now, I'm not saying all these were good cars. I'm just saying they were popular because they were little 4-cylinders, and there was starting to get competition between the Japanese automakers and the German automakers and the American automakers in the 4-cylinder realm. And so the 80s, there was a lot of vacuum hoses. You pop the hood on an 80s car, most 80s cars, and the engine bay was just crammed with vacuum lines. And good luck if the engine is acting up, trying to find the leak, which vacuum hose or line is leaking. And so then you got into the 90s when fuel injection and the late 80s, early 90s when fuel injection started taking over and things like that. Well, you had people not wanting to mess with the modern fuel injection, the EFIs and all that stuff. Nobody wanted to mess with that. And but then that became more common. And in the same realm, I'm sure hybrids and EVs will become more common and things like that. I feel like I've done enough, in my years, um, to where I'm just, yeah, I'm ready to kind of more step away and be more of a teacher than to stay in the wrenching realm. So, um, I also sold cars. I took my run of the gambit selling cars in my early 20s. Um, I worked for a couple of dealerships selling cars, and I didn't like it. I wasn't good. I'll be honest, I was not good at selling cars because I was more mechanic based, and by then I'd kind of started learning what cars were good, what cars had certain problematic areas, things like that. And so I would get a customer on the lot. I worked at a used car dealer first, and we just sold everything. And I would go out and know I'd have a list of what cars I liked that were good and would be a good car for someone to buy. And uh, so I would try to steer my customers to those cars because I was trying to help them get into something that's going to be reliable. And some of the people want what they want, and they would come on the lot, maybe saw the BMW that we had, or some other kind of sports car that I know had been through 6 owners before it got to us, and you know been modded and hacked on, and but yet it's cool, they want it. And I'm trying to steer them over to this nice car that maybe some elderly person had that took care of it. And if you're going to go into debt on a car, then at least have something that's going to last. Well, I just, people thought I had good intentions, but I guess people thought I was trying to push them a horrible car or something. But yeah, I didn't do well in car sales. But I learned the industry. I learned how the dealerships operate. I learned the little tricks of the trade and things like that. So I can help people when they go out. I'm like, hey, make sure you ask for this or that. So I've been in the automotive industry pretty much my whole life. Um, but back to the vehicles, and the generations, the 90s. The 90s, because the fuel injection got more familiar, they were pretty much all built the same in a sense, to where they all have the same parts. Just find where they're located to replace it, and you didn't have a lot of deviation across the board. Not a lot. Now there were, obviously you have German engineering, and it's a little more complex, but it wasn't a lot of deviation back then. It's almost like outside of the shell, the body of the car, they were almost the same skeleton underneath, almost. And then you had the 2000s, like I said earlier, the horsepower started coming back. We started reaching into the 300 horsepower range, and then they would scrape into the 4. And then it was the late 2000s where they were, let's go for 5. Now, early 90s, they did have a few cars, like more of your super cars that would scrape into the 500 realm. And then you had your Vipers, you had your Lamborghinis, you had your Ferraris, you had things like that would hit into the 500 horsepower mark. But really, in modern attainable cars, that didn't happen until the late 2000s. And I was thinking, while I was out in the garage, I'm looking at the Shelby and wanted to drive it, and I was kind of got me thinking. I was like, maybe I believe I have one of the cheapest access points to 500 horsepower. One of the cheapest, not the cheapest. I would say the only cheaper access point to 500 horsepower would be a clapped out Mercedes SL55. That would probably be the cheapest. But then you're looking at a whole lot of money invested to get that car sorted out if you was going to take on that. So then you're right back into almost what I have in the Shelby. So, so my next video, while we're on this, I'm gonna make another video on how to shop for what I recommend doing if you are in the market for a performance vehicle or not necessarily a sports car, but like a performance car, because there's so many. They're two different things. You have a performance car that's got a lot of horsepower and built to do track things, and then you have a sports car which looks sporty. It don't have a lot of horsepower and just fun to drive, right? But I want to make a video because I think so many people buy their cars wrong. They don't buy their car. Let me rephrase this. I don't think people buy the cars for the way they intend to use them, if that makes sense. And I'll explain that on my next video. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed. God bless. See you on the next one.